It's officially mushroom building day. We're back here already at the Marshy Grove with our little witch manor right here, and today's the day that we really start cranking out a bunch of the naturey and terrain aesthetics around this area to really start to piece this puzzle together. Recently, we've come out to this area and started building up a little bit of our fantasy region of the world, and so far that consisted of 2 different build collabs that I did with other creators, the first of which being this witch manor right here with Infinite Drift, and then of course a lot of the surrounding and build up area over here with Megibite. Both fantastic creators, and I had a lot of fun doing that, but today we are all on our own, and I have a great idea for what I want to get accomplished in this episode, and it involves mushrooms, of course, and quite a few of them in the surrounding area over here. We really need to start bringing this place together and making it feel a little more sectioned off from the surrounding world. I've talked about in a couple previous episodes that long-term, the goal for this area is to have one big main piece, and that's going to happen from off of the plateau up there and kind of come up and over top. I'm not sure if I've mentioned what that piece will be yet, but some of you may already know because I've talked about it on a stream here or there. Anyway, that is going to need its own entire episode, and I didn't want to do that until I had everything else in this area complete first. So if we make our way up the hill over here where we can see everything from our little staging ground, I've prepared a ton of stuff in various shulker boxes, and as a matter of fact, I'm going to probably need to go get some more because I'm really starting to hurt on storage in this world. And that does remind me, storage is also something that we'll have to figure out in one of the upcoming episodes, so that should be pretty exciting when the time comes. Back to the topic at hand though, I've got a bunch of stuff left over from when we built the house and the surrounding terrain down there, and that's probably going to help us out quite a bit. I'm thinking I'm going to add a bunch of different custom mushrooms all around the area, mostly leaning kind of over here and then on this hillside right here. And as a matter of fact, this hillside itself is not going to remain unchanged. We're actually going to do a good amount of terraforming outside of just building the organics. I'm thinking a really good start would be building up a little bit of an elevated section of land kind of in this space right here with a little bit of a cliffside, just kind of building up to it, and that'll really help section off all of this area and make it feel like it's a little lower down versus the rest of it, and it kind of takes away that feeling that this is just one big field and it suddenly turns a little swampy. It's going to kind of give it a little more distinction, and like I said, a little bit of a boundary of sorts, a little bit of a divider from one area of this land to this area right here that we've been really putting the work into in the last couple episodes. Fortunately, I've already prepared everything we're going to need for this, so why waste any more time? Let's get that little cliffside built. that definitely changes the look around here. I think that part we've definitely accomplished. Now, a couple of things I want to go over with what we've just put in place. The main goal being that we've now made this place feel much more enclosed in the space that we're in, given we already had this big hill right here, this natural plateau that generated, and then of course the custom hill we just built. Now, they don't exactly match per se, and I wasn't necessarily going for it. Now, if I wanted to rocky up this surface or even kind of dirt across this surface to make it match, sure, we could do that, but I felt like it would be a little more interesting if I left the custom terrain feeling a little more custom. Not only that, but you'll notice that it's not overly detailed. There's a little bit of shading in there, and I might still touch it up a little further. At least when we get to the deep slate, it's quite the contrast, and I might go with something a little more subtle towards the bottom. But either way, the lack of detail, or at least extreme detail in the side, is that this is not meant to be the focus. So what we've built here with this big hill, this is meant to make the place feel more enclosed, like I mentioned. But our focus is going to be with what we build a little later on, which is going to be a bunch of organics, really bringing the place to life with some more mushrooms, much like what I did there, but of some different colors and shapes and sizes, all filling out this area to really hammer home that fantasy wildlife aspect. Would fungus be considered wildlife? I don't know, but it kind of makes sense. A little bit. Either way, point being, this is not going to be the main focus at the end of the day, so I think once we get the rest of everything put together and built up in this area, and this big custom hill becomes more of a background component and more of a supplementary piece, I think that's when this is really going to shine, as opposed to where it is right now, where it's just kind of this big cliff that in a lot of ways is jarring and doesn't really match a lot of what's going on around it. I think we give it time, we trust the process, we see it through, and we end up with something pretty nice. There is a couple of gaps still. This gap right here where I have our little staging grounds, it just so happened that I had it right where I was going to build that, so that was a little quirk I didn't see coming. That'll get fixed a little later on once I'm ready to pick everything up and move. And then up top, I left a little bit of room, a little bit of scuff where I think I'm going to put a mushroom, at least one. We might do two, maybe three. I'm going to kind of play it by ear and see, but I felt like having some mushrooms up top as well would kind of help tie everything together. Now, of course, I wanted what we built here to be nice and visible, and I really wanted the effect it has to take place from anywhere you're walking over in this area specifically, as you follow the little pathway through this highly detailed area we built, and then of course, make your way towards the house. So I made sure that from over here, the sightline worked in such a way that it was always present, much like the other naturally generated plateau up here is as well, so that it really hammers home that feeling that you're kind of in a more sunken area where the marshy, muddy feeling makes a little more sense. And of course, we do have that big natural hill on the other side of the house, which works to help all of this as well. You can see from over here that in the regular stone area, I did a mixture of stone, andesite, and light gray wool to kind of get a little bit of a patchy, splotchy coloration and texture change throughout the regular stone, so that it wasn't all just one consistent thing, kind of like what happens with the shading a little bit, but of course that shading is meant to be viewed from further away. That's kind of how it's designed and what makes it look the best. But when it comes to the grass, I tried a couple new things that I'm not used to doing. A lot of times moss is a go-to to work with grass, and it does work really good, but I figured why stop there, and why not play around with mixing in some other things. So you can see we've got a little bit of green wool and some green concrete, and that gives us two more unique shades of green, as well as two more unique textures that aren't quite represented between grass and moss. And so what I did was I tried to be a little splotchy with everything as we go throughout the hill. You'll see big patterns of moss, you'll see some areas that are untouched grass, you'll see some spots that are concrete, some that are wool. And the idea was that we could make this place look all that more interesting in somewhat a subtle fashion. And at the end of the day, I think it turned out pretty good. This is something I'm gonna have to experiment with a little bit more when it comes to grass detailing and terraforming whenever I need to in the future. It is worth mentioning also that I have not yet taken the bone meal or loose strands of grass and ferns and all of that to this area up here, and I do indeed intend to do that, because leaving it all boring and plain like this is a little bit jarring for sure. especially with how detailed everything around the area is. I think we'll save all of the grassy bits and bone meal and whatnot for once I go through and we start building all of the organics and mushrooms and all of that around the area, so you'll probably see that come together towards the end of the episode. Before we move on, however, I did want to bring some attention to the backside of the build, and not just because it's actually done, but rather there is a purpose back here. So I talked a lot on the other side about how the other side is meant to be a background piece, something that's supplementary to some of the things that are going to draw your eye. Now over here, it kind of works in reverse. I don't currently plan to build much of anything out in this area, at least not for the time being. That day may come in the future, but for now we have this big wide open area between our starter house over there and of course where we're building over here. And because there's no real detail or big builds out here other than the hill itself, at least from this direction, I figured I would try and build it in a way that this became more of a focal point. So I took a little bit extra time with how I shaped everything, the stone patterns, the grass patterns, all of that, to get something that looked like it could be a focal point, especially once there's a lot of grass up there and we kind of take the attention to detail with bone mealing and all of those little things, patch up some of these holes and whatnot, so that whenever you're approaching this area from where our starter house is, or even anything further on beyond that direction over there, you have something that draws your eye, that's meant to draw your eye, and it's not this background piece that doesn't have anything to draw your attention away from it, if that makes sense. Like, from this side, you're supposed to focus on it, and from the other side, you're not supposed to focus on it. But like, we build it good enough that you can focus on it on the other side, or not on this side, and it still works, and it's still fine. Surely you get the idea, right? And then, of course, there is the view from up top here. This is a really good view of the area, I think. I really like how it looks, and I do think after we get the rest of the organics and some more mushrooms built throughout the area, it is going to look great. But more specifically, once we can cap this area off with the big detail from over here on the right side, kind of lingering over the whole build, that is really going to be something. The goal is that it is going to make this place feel so magical, especially from up here on the hill, as well as when you're approaching it from the muddy road down there. You're kind of splitting these two hills and entering this sunken area. You're going to have this huge looming thing taking up the sky right here, and I think it's going to paint such a nice picture. I cannot wait for when we do that, and I think when we do, we definitely got to make sure to get all kinds of different angles. Some of the best might just be from up on this new hill. Alright, so I mentioned before that I want to build a bunch of different mushrooms in this area. That's really going to be how we start to fill this place up, give you some more stuff to look at, and bring it to life. Now, I don't want to just throw that into a big time lapse and then build all of it in one go and then explain it all afterwards, like we do a lot of the time, and there's nothing wrong with that. But I would like to give you guys a little bit more of an insight as we build them into what I'm thinking and all of the other little details that go on in my mind about where I place it and the shapes and how it relates to everything around it. I think that's something that we could do a lot more often when it comes to building things on this series, is taking the time to kind of break it down just a little bit more. And it's something I've been experimenting with just a little bit in recent episodes, as you may have noticed, and I think we've done a pretty decent job with it. That being said, the first mushroom that I want to get built is going to be right over in this area right here, next to where we've got some of these grass details and even cattails over there. It's going to sit pretty much in front of the house, but again, it's important to remember that the main sight line we're focused on is the sight line from the pathway to and from this area, the muddy area that goes over in this direction. So given that's the case, what we build over here is going to take up a lot of this space in the air just behind this big old stump, and will eventually be accompanied by some other things to help fill up some more of these areas around as well, to eventually paint a picture that's full of all kinds of different custom mushrooms and life, and we'll start to see this place really start to flourish. So the first mushroom we're going to build is going to be a pretty large brown mushroom, and the brown mushroom isn't going to look anything like your traditional Minecraft vanilla brown mushrooms. We're going to give it a lot more detail than that, and of course it will be a good amount bigger. All right, so before we get started on building it, I wanted to go over the palette just a little bit. We've got our 4 blocks that are going to make up the stem of the mushroom right here, and then I'll explain the cap a little bit after. So we're going with bone blocks towards the very bottom of it, that being the lightest of these colors. That will transition into mushroom stem, which is a little bit darker than even the sandstone, but it's a little more on that white scale before it really starts to crank yellow when we get to the smooth sandstone, and then of course the stripped birch. So I figured the best spot for the mushroom stem would be right there. And the idea here is that these colors are going to differentiate based on shading. So as we get a little bit higher up the stem and a little more underneath the cap where less light can access, we're going to have this stripped birch color right here, whereas towards the very base, where the most light might be, we're of course going to have the bone blocks. Now, this shading technique is going to be something that you'll see throughout every mushroom that we build in this episode. It's something that I'm going to try and be consistent with throughout, even though not all of the mushroom stems are going to consist of these 4 blocks specifically. The biggest drawback being bone blocks, and you have this right here that you can't really do anything with. If you're going to have 2 sides of it exposed, you're kind of just stuck dealing with it. But at the end of the day, that is Minecraft, and we gotta make what we have work. So that's gonna make up the stem. We know the shading, and we know it's going to apply to multiple different mushrooms. So I mentioned that this is going to be a brown mushroom. Now for the cap of this one, we're gonna have a combination of 3 different blocks right here, and as a matter of fact, it's gonna look a little more like this. We're gonna go from spruce planks at its darkest to just regular old dirt to packed mud at its lightest. Now, a lot of these caps are going to have more than 3 blocks, like you can see over on that red mushroom right there. I can count 1, 2, 3, 4, at least 5, 6 maybe blocks in that alone, not even counting all of the slabs. And much like the mushroom stem, not all of the mushrooms are going to be built the same. So not only are we going to have other colors of mushrooms for the caps, but we're also going to have different types of materials, different numbers of materials. It's going to vary and change quite a bit. But again, just like with the stem, I'm going for a more shading based approach rather than just pure texturing. So we're going to have the darkest color, which in this case for this mushroom is the spruce plank. We're going to have this down around the edges and opposite of where the main light is hitting the mushroom. Now, what I'm referring to as the main light hitting the mushroom is going to be a little tricky because of course the sun moves throughout the day, so we're just kind of stuck picking one spot as where we think the light is currently shining the most on the mushroom, lighting it up the most, and then from there, around the edges, we'll get a little bit darker, which in this case will be dirt, and then finally spruce on the farthest ends of where the packed mud or lightest block sits. It's a little tricky to explain beforehand, but bear with me, and once we get it built, I can kind of show you a little bit better. As we get this next mushroom built, and the first of this big expansion of a bunch of them, I want to point out that it turns out significantly better than what I had done on the back of the Witch Manor. And that's because between then and now, I have been making it a point to try and learn Axiom. It's a really, really useful tool for a lot of building, and I've started to incorporate it a little bit here and there. I mentioned it a little earlier in the episode as well, but specifically with organics as well, it can be super useful. The mushrooms that I have been able to design using Axiom kind of as a tool to help with that has been night and day difference from anything I've been able to do before. And I want to take a second to shout out Calvin, who has an incredible tutorial on learning Axiom. I cannot recommend giving that tutorial series a watch, and also taking a look at some of the other things Calvin does as well, because they are a super talented builder and creator. And if you don't know of Calvin, you've been missing out. We've got the first mushroom in place here, or I guess the second or third, depending on how you count the other 2, but I wanted to give you a little bit of a walkthrough so you can kind of see the shape and the different viewpoints of this big brown mushroom that we had just put together. I think it fits this area perfectly. It fills this spot very nicely just to the left of the stump and a little bit further away from where we have the house and everything else going on. And of course, like I've been hinting at, this is going to be one of many. Now, this is going to be one of the larger ones, maybe the largest. Some of the other ones are going to be a little bit smaller, all bigger than those tiny guys right there, but kind of somewhere in between that range. The biggest thing is getting them big enough to be able to shape them nicely, but not too big so that they are overpowering in this area. Now, my definition of overpowering for this area would be pretty big because all of them at the end of the day are going to be multiple sizes bigger than the player. But in the grand scheme of things, I think it'll fit the vibe we're going for in this area. And while it might be a little jarring at first, you're gonna have to hear me out. Regardless, here's what the big brown mushroom looks like throughout all of the pathway area right here. I think we've done something really cool. I like that it's placed down by a lot of these grassy details and the little cattails down there as well. I think the shaping of it turned out really good, and a lot of that is thanks to some of the tools that I have on Axiom, of course. I went ahead and made this mushroom a little bit of a double, kind of like what we've got up on the chimney, and not something that we really played around with on that red one over there. I don't know how many of these I'll add like a secondary little cap growing off of the main one from, but I think it's a nice little detail here and there just to sprinkle it up that little bit extra. If we make our way to the front porch of the house, this is what it looks like from over here. So not the best sightline for it. It's definitely aimed at being viewed from the pathway over there. But at the end of the day, you still know it's a mushroom. You can still see what's going on right here. And it does kind of take on its own unique look from this side where the cap looks a little more circular and a little less pointed on the top. So you kind of get a couple different mushrooms in one in a way. I'm really happy with how that one turned out. I feel like I'm learning a lot about organics and mushroom building specifically. And as for the rest of them that I want to build around this area, we have a multitude of colors. We're going to add some red ones, some more brown ones. I've even got some crazy ones. We're going to do an orange one, a white one, and maybe even one extra to kind of match what's going on with the chimney in the manor. So I think I've gathered enough materials to make all of these mushrooms possible. It is going to take a minute to build, however, but I'm super excited and I don't want to wait anymore to get the rest of this area fleshed out and get all of these mushrooms thriving. I've got to say, this is probably the most interesting way that I have filled space before. I've done a little bit of trees in my time, but I have never done mushrooms, never done them like this at the very least. A lot of what we've been doing in this episode and the last has really been an introduction into organics like mushrooms specifically, and I guess just fungus for me as a builder, being I've never really played around with it too much before. And I've got to say, it is a lot of fun to put put these together, once you can start to get the right shapes and start to figure out exactly how you're supposed to go about it to really capture that true to real life or even fantasy depictions of various mushrooms and fungus and plant life, generally speaking, getting these organics just right. Once you kind of make it click in your mind and you can really start to paint these out in blocks, it starts to become a lot of fun to put these together. I understand why people who build mushrooms have so much fun with it now that I've done this whole area and we've got so many of these in place. And I do think this does a lot to really sell the area quite a bit. Of course, there's still a fair amount of like vanilla Minecraft stuff going on in the background that can kind of pull you out of the immersion just a little bit, but I think that's okay. At the end of the day, if we were to continue just going around the outskirts and continually touching up everything, we would be here for another 20 episodes. And while we very well may do more work out here, outside of what we're wrapping up in this episode and what I want to do in the next one, I think we're going to step away from this area right after that and focus a little bit on that secret third area. I'm really excited to get to that. But that's a little further down the line still. Let's talk about the mushrooms that we've put in place here. So as I mentioned before, we were going to have a wide range of different mushrooms, from brown ones to red ones to blue and orange, and we even have a white cap over there. And even at that, there are 2 different brown mushrooms, 2 different red mushrooms, and then it's the same one orange one twice, and then we have 1 white, 1 blue, of course. So we got a good range. I tried to build enough of them that we would feel like the area was varied up enough once we had them all in place, and I think we did a pretty good job with that. There were a couple of these mushrooms that were easier than others, a couple of them that proved pretty difficult. I would say the hardest one of all of them was actually the white cap over there, which I tried to give some extra details up along the stem, and I used some real life mushroom references for that. We tried to get a little bit of some fuzzies and this little ring going around the stem right there. And then of course with white cap mushrooms, a lot of the time they're so perfectly shaped around the base of the cap that I really tried to capture that, but it was tricky. This still feels a little bit petrified, like it's made out of some kind of stone or wood, and I mean, it kind of is with, you know, diorite and pale oak being involved, but I think we did just enough around the edges and around the details on the stem right there to just sell it that little bit more. I used a little bit of the new pale moss carpet to get a little bit of these like dirt details because it's so white that any specks of dirt would show up a little more. So I think that was accomplished pretty nicely as well, but that was definitely the trickiest of all of them. And in terms of which one's my favorite, it's kind of a toss-up. It's either this big brown one right here that we started with, or it's the big red one over there. One of those two. I think it's just because the bigger you go, the more detailed and the better shaping you can get, and that's why I like those two so much. But of course, given the scale of this area, I didn't want to have too many of these really big mushrooms. We only had a couple of them. Otherwise, we were going to start to make everything else around this place feel a little bit too small, so I had to stick with this sort of medium scale right here, where we've got a couple brown ones, the red ones, and then of course, the fun colors as well. All in all, I am really happy with how everything turned out, and I'm really happy with how it makes this place feel. As a matter of fact, now's a good time to bring back to your attention the hillside that we did earlier in this episode. I had been mentioning that it's not supposed to be a foreground element. It's not supposed to draw your eye. It's supposed to be supplementary to some of the other things that do draw your eye. And I think right here we can see that pretty well, where we've got these mushrooms drawing your attention. We of course have the first one up there. We've got a red one, an orange one. We even have one brown one, smaller, all the way up on top. And then we've got some more going on around here as well. So that hillside in the background kind of acts as the supplementary piece. I've been using that word a lot in this episode, where you still notice it, and it just helps improve everything going on in this situation. But because it's not your main focus and you have these other pops of color and these other organics to draw your attention, we can get away with things like a slightly less detailed cliff face and shaping for the hill back there. We can kind of keep it relatively simple. It does the trick, it does its job, and we don't need to overcomplicate it or spend too much time on that when we could be doing other things like these mushrooms. I think that's a valuable little tool when it comes to building. It's something that we'll continue to use as we progress through this world. As a matter of fact, you could even get away with putting something else right here. I decided not to because it was starting to feel a little bit crowded, or at least get close to feeling a little bit crowded, and I didn't want to go too overboard with how many we built, but you very well could, and could even sprinkle in some trees or bushes around here as well. And who knows, maybe we end up deciding to do that after all. But for now, I think we've done a whole lot to transform this area entirely, and we've set it up perfectly for what I want to get to in the next episode. I've hinted at it a bunch already, and you're probably dying to know what it is. As a matter of fact, some of you do already know, as I've hinted at before. But right above us here, stemming from this vanilla hill, this plateau up here, we are going to build an absolutely massive jacaranda tree. Jacaranda, however you pronounce it. We're gonna build a huge custom version of that kind of tree. It's going to be even bigger than the tree that we built next to our fantasy house in the first couple of episodes. And I cannot wait to get it in place because I think it is really going to make this place pop. That is going to be the spire of this region, if you will, that huge build that you can't help but notice from super far away, and it draws your attention and wows you wherever you see it from. Now, I'm looking up here because we're not just going to build it up on the hill. It's actually going to be built out of the slope, and it is going to hang over top a lot of this area. We're going to have the tree kind of at this 45-degree angle or something similar, where the canopy and the branches sprawl out over top, and we're going to end up with these pockets of light through the canopy shining down here where we're standing around the mud and the mushrooms, and then some areas are going to be a little more shaded, and it's going to transform this area completely just after we already transformed it in this episode. I am super excited to get that build started. It's gotta be planned. I haven't started building it at all in planning and concept building or anything like that. So I've got that tall task ahead of me, as well as, of course, building it in the next episode. So needless to say, if the time between this episode and the next one is a little bit longer, you probably know why. It may even involve a little bit of custom terraforming as well up on that hillside, just to make it work a little bit better. We'll see how it goes. I don't want to have to redo this entire hillside right here or add a bunch to the top, but anything I need to do to kind of help supplement the tree that I want to build in here and maybe the roots around the area, we'll go ahead and do that, and I'll try to keep it at that. Regardless, that is something that's going to take a lot of time, and speaking of time, I've been in a little bit of crunch to get this episode out to you guys in time because it's been quite a while since the last one came out, and I didn't want it to go even longer. So with that in mind, you'll have to let me know down in the comments if you'd like to see any other details around this area, what you think might look good, and what you thought of all of the mushrooms that we built. As always, I want to give a special shout out to everyone who supports the content over on Patreon. It's thanks to you guys I can do this. And don't forget, if anyone else wants to join, the link is down in the description. With all that said and done, I've got a huge tree to go plan and episode to work on. So as always, I hope you left today feeling just a little bit inspired.